Right, George.
Fine, thank you, Sean. How are you? Thank you very
Yeah,
much
I'm
for
not
having me
bad.
on.
It's all right. It's all right. Would you like to start sharing your presentation
Yeah,
and
of
we
course
can
I
work? Okay.
can.
I'll just stop sharing and muting, and I'll let.
Right. So my name's George. I am a senior orthotist at the London Orthotics Consultancy. And today, what we're basically going to be looking over is our treatment approach that we sort of developed with Elaine, Owen over the last sort of like 6 years or so. I've been with LAC for about 2 years now, but I've learnt a lot in those 2 years, definitely a lot. So we describe it as the optimal segmental kinematic, the optimal segment kinematics and alignment approach to rehabilitation, which is a bit of a mouthful. So we just describe it as the OSKAR clinic or the OSKAR approach. So first of all, let's just start the presentation. So what is OSKAR? Like, what are we actually doing here? So today we're focusing more on patients with cerebral palsy, mainly pediatric patients, and we're focusing more on AFOs. So Nikki had a fantastic presentation on standardization on AFOs and the descriptions of them. I will try to use the correct descriptions during this because exactly like Nikki was saying, I have used the term rigid AFO in the past, but I have also used the term fixed AFO or solid AFO. These are all variations of the same inherent design. But anyway, so OSKAR itself is the use of the combination of using orthotics, physio, and gait analysis to try to create an optimal walking pattern, and then focusing on a well-fitting appropriate orthosis, a good physio program, and quality of walking in the form, and using that as a form of rehabilitation. So why do we do this? We've got one of my patients sort of walking on loop up our Gait Lab with a set of our AFOs. But why do we do this? And the main reason why is in this category, most kids with cerebral palsy have some sort of physical disability, and it is very common for them to see physio, for them to see orthotics, for them to eventually see orthopedic surgeons of the such to try to help them with their sort of treatments. And we've been working with Elaine like we described, and we've sort of been using, we've been doing some really great work. So we just thought, or I just thought it'd be quite good to sort of talk about it, talk about what we can sort of achieve when you combine these things together, rather than just doing orthotics in a cupboard and then in the basement of the hospital and physio out in the car park, and Gait Lab is not even included because the waiting list is 12 months and is in a different city. Trying to include them all together. I know this is a very optimal approach and not everyone's going to have it. I know I'm very, very lucky, but I would just like to sort of describe what we kind of do and why I think it's very important, and from what I've sort of seen, how effective it can be. We're mainly going to be describing AFOs as that sort of description of the session today. It is also probably the most common orthosis that we use in terms of these sorts of patients. Not that we don't use any other types, but we will be discussing sort of rigid AFOs and rigid AFOs with anterior shells most of the time today. There will be one or two bits or pieces about articulated AFOs, and there will be a little bit about SMOs, but very, very minor, mainly talking about more rigid AFOs. So first of all, we sort of developed this clinical system using the ICF guidelines, the International Classification of Functional Disability and Health, from the World Health Organization. And we sort of separated out into these separate sort of categories: body structure and function, participation, personal factors, environmental factors, and activities. And we can mainly influence these ones with what we can do. As an orthotist, I create orthotics. I do go through a lot of physio with my patients because you need to be able to get them up and walking in the clinic. It does take quite a lot of time, but it does seem to work out quite well. So for instance, we would be trying to look at influencing the segments during walking, their sort of participation at school, what they can do at home, what they can do in school, and their sort of standing balance, their ambulation, and then muscular tendinal unit lengths, which I'll talk about towards the end, as we've had a paper published with a few of my colleagues and Elaine about lengthening calves, even in plantar flex AFOs. So a patient will come in. This looks like a big wall of text, but I promise you we won't go through all of it. A patient will come in, they'll sit down, and their parents will talk to me about how they are concerned about their long-term well-being, what's going on. No one's really explained anything to them, and we will go through quite a lot of these bits and pieces. In terms of the main things I want to try to talk to them about, and main things I want to try to discuss with them, because it's not something that is normally discussed that well. I'll sort of focus on these specific aspects. All of this is very important, but I'll sort of just go over these for today. So in terms of orthoses, one of the big things we want to try to do is we want to try to keep the foot healthy. If we let a child with lot of neuro-disability, a lot of weakness, a lot of stiffness, a lot of tight muscles and such, their feet will really take the impact. And we've probably all seen it, all the clinicians out there have probably seen the long-term effects of walking on these feet. So sort of one of the main points is to really make sure these feet are nice and healthy, make sure that they are the best feet that we can really get, because once the patients have stopped growing, that's kind of it. We're a bit stuck. So trying to use an orthosis to try to hold that foot is a really important thing to do. In terms of the MTUs and the skin, one of the things we'd like to really focus on is optimizing lengthening and shortening of certain muscles when standing and walking. So what we mean by that is to make sure that we are stretching the right muscles and we are stopping the muscles from getting overlong. The sort of visions of the hyperextending walker turning into the crouch walker as they get older due to an overlong soleus or a weak soleus. And a long muscle is just as dangerous as a sort of short muscle and can be quite hard to undo once it begins. My favorite thing to talk about in terms of when talking with my patients and their parents is talking about the motor learning. So it's very common for kids with neuro-disabilities to really struggle with the coordination. They've got to activate quads at the right time, hamstrings at the right time, all the various muscles in the foot in the right time. It's a very complex system to work with. So trying to provide a device and trying to provide some therapy to try to teach them that aspect over and over and over. Like I said before, it's all about quality of walking as a form of rehabilitation. There's no point having a half-tuned AFO or an AFO that doesn't really fit very well, because they're not going to walk in that perfect way. And that is what we're really trying to aim for. And then probably the most important in terms of these things is their actual functionality. They've got to actually be able to live their life, do what they need to do. They need to go to school. They need to socialize with friends. That's pretty much the main thing we talk about when we talk to our patients, especially when they start getting to sort of like 10-year-old to the teenager years. They're really talking about, they want to play football with their friends. They want to be able to stand in class. They want to be able to do these things. And it is our jobs really to facilitate that, to help them in whatever way we can, while trying to do everything else that I've previously already talked about. And then probably the one at the bottom that you can all see is pain, trying to prevent and reduce pain. So what we don't want to happen is we don't want for poor foot structure to lead to early arthritis. We don't want muscle over short or over long muscles to lead to muscular pains, because that will really impact their lives, their daily lives. That'll be the biggest impact. And when you see these old sort of cerebral palsy patients and such, that's the main thing that they always come back to us about. It's never that they want to suddenly start walking a bit more or the such. It's always that something's starting to hurt, and by that point it's harder to treat, because you can't prevent it from happening. You've just got to treat what you're what you've been dealt with. So you've discussed that with all the patient, and then we'll go to the clinical exam, as any good clinician will know. I won't go through all of this because we'll be here for days. But we would assess everything that is, we would check out what is short, we'll check out what is weak, we'll check out what's tight, and then we'll put that all together to sort of determine what might be the issues first before we start looking at the gait. So here is the original Elaine Owen algorithm. Nikki was talking about it earlier, but here is the, here is it in all its glory. We use it a lot. We've got it framed on the wall, so we can always talk about it in terms of what we're doing and why we're doing it for our patients. And I normally try to separate it into sort of 3 categories. So we've got the actual AFO design, we've got the footwear and the SVA design, and then we've got the footwear, heel and sole design, which I'll try to go through generally as we sort of go along, and sort of why it's all very important. So in terms of the first section is always looking at shank kinematics, because shank kinematics are quite, will influence everything else that happens. So do we have normal shank kinematics? If we have, if the answer is yes, we'll look at swing phase issues or initial contact issues, and then we might determine whether it's posterior leaf or a hinged AFO or an articulated AFO, as Nikki would now say, and I completely agree. Or we would talk about a fixed AFO if there is a stance phase issue, or a rigid AFO, as we should probably start calling it. So we have the 2 sort of main ones that we normally see. So we have a reclined shank or a hyperextended knee, and we have an over-inclined shank or a crouch gait, is what we typically describe them as. But they're the 2 most common types that we will see, and they're the 2 most common types that we sort of treat. I'll just go very quickly into sort of dorsiflexion tree AFOs. The sort of algorithm to determine these, or the articulated AFOs, as I should now be calling them, is that they're very, very stringent on what would be an okay prescription for it. So you've got to have length in your gastroc, you've got to have a low amount of tone, you've got to have the right strength, and you've got to have the right bony alignment. And if you don't, then you're contraindicated for these devices. So I'm being constantly asked, why have I only got a heel on my AFO, and why have I not got joints in my AFO? And the answer is because you typically, very often, will not fit those categories. We do have patients in these devices, but typically they are more temporary devices in the sense that they will use them for sports, so they will use them for certain activities, but they will use other more supportive devices for their day-to-day lives. So they'll go to school in a pair of rigid AFOs, but they will do their football in a pair of articulated AFOs. One of the most important things that we always get taught, we spend a lot of time discussing, is the ankle or the angle in the AFO, as a poorly optimized angle will be the determining factor between a well-fitting orthosis that works very well and a not very well-fitting orthosis, or extra bulk or extra weight that is not really necessary. And most of the time it comes down to this muscle. It comes down to the gastrocnemius, which is a tri-jointed muscle, which I was always taught in uni it was a bi-jointed muscle, but obviously, as we can see here, it goes over the knee joint, the ankle joint, and the subtalar joint. And the subtalar joint's the one that's always quite important, in the sense that we will take measurements from in full supination, full rear foot supination, and in rear foot neutral, and then rear foot pronation, so we can see the differences between them. The clinicians out there will have seen a lot of skate valgus happen. It's a very, very common condition. To sort of get over a tight soleus or a tight gastroc will be to pronate the ankle to try to get that extra little bit of range as you're trying to get over. But that is something that we have to look into, and something we have to really be careful about when we're designing these AFOs. So here's a sort of expanded picture on the ankle or the angle, and you can see there's a lot going on there. It's not necessarily that complex once you've done it a few times, but it does look very daunting to look at. So just sort of going on from this, a very common myth is that we stand with our ankles at 90 degrees. And do we do that? No, we don't. I mean, if we did, our knees would be hyperextended. That's just how the biomechanics of the body works. But I am not so much now, but I was in the past very commonly asked why my AFOs weren't set at 90 degrees. And I mean, this is a very famous photo of from Elaine about a lady walking barefoot and a lady walking with a high heel on, and the high heel is about sort of -15, -20 perhaps. So it's a pretty substantial heel. But if you look at the differences between the two, the actual shank kinematics, the actual important bits in walking are almost identical. I mean, if I block out those feet, obviously you can see which ones, and you all know which ones have the heel raise on. You wouldn't really be able to tell the difference between them. I certainly wouldn't. If I blocked out all those feet, I probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference between which one's which. But that is that's why it's separated. The ankle of the angle is separate from the shank to vertical angle, which is what I'll talk about in a bit. But it is very necessary in terms of AFO design. So here we have an AFO set at -10. And the main reasons for that, like we've already discussed, is to accommodate the range of motion in the ankle and to accommodate the position of the foot. So the range of motion is quite a simple one. If the gastroc can only achieve -10, then you'll put it in -10. If you accommodate the position of the foot, what we mean by that is we might have a patient with a really overly pronated foot shape or a very unstable foot shape, and we will be talking about plantar flexing the AFO to release that gastroc to get that subtalar joint into a better position so that we can hold that foot in a better position, so we can grow that foot in a better position. That is the whole, that was the first point I sort of made on that little chart that we had. And it is a very important one because we can always, there are certain bits that we can always look back on and we can always do, but we can't really regrow a foot after it's been done, after it's finished growing. So a little bit about our Gait Lab. Like I said, I'm very lucky in that I get to use this Gait Lab as much as I want. But we've got BTS Bioengineering 2D video vector Gait Lab with force plates embedded in the floor. We've got 2 cameras, as you can see me walking up and down below, and then we use Dartfish to assess the videos in real time. So we've got our 2 patients, we've got reclined and we've got over inclined shanks. The reason why we use a Gait Lab is for this pure reason. This is a very good diagram that my director made. So we've got a ground reaction force happening behind the knee. We've got the point of application. We've got the vector. We know where the knee joint is, and we know that knee joint should be flexing, but isn't. And we know where that ground reaction force needs to be for it to be a good walking pattern, to try and get those shanks and those thighs into a better kinematic position. So we have 2 types of AFOs. Nikki was sort of talking about it a little bit earlier in terms of the sort of difference in designs of foot metatarsal positions, whether or not it's behind the metatarsals. We normally describe that as flexible mets, or whether they're in front or anterior. We talk about that as a fixed metatarsal AFO. Exactly like Nikki was saying, we might describe the one on the right as a grapho, but we would describe it as a fixed metatarsal AFO with separate anterior front section. But again, I will be re-looking over all this as Nikki has already described. And the reasons behind these would be the 2 different types of shank kinematics that we've already discussed. So we've got a reclined shank on the left with a flexible metatarsal. We're trying to bring them over. We're trying to push that shank forward or incline it a little bit more. And we've got the fixed metatarsals. We're trying to recline that shank a little bit more because it's too inclined. The reason why I talk about trim lines and being so important is because of this image. So we've got a before and after in terms of mid stance and terminal stance with the same patient, with the same AFOs. And beforehand, we've got a pretty massive extension force sort of coming in front of the knees. That the green area, the GRF, is coming in front of the knees and he's pushing his legs backwards, and he's having to lean forwards to lean into it to get himself over the AFOs. It's very common in these sorts of conditions that you'll find that the patients can't stop, they can't slow down, they feel like they have to run or they have to go up onto their toes sort of compensate for this excessive extension force happening. And we just trimmed off a tiny little bit of the AFO, just that little white line, is just how much we trimmed back. And suddenly the ground reaction forces on the knee joint center, that's the word, it is perfectly vertical where they're standing much more upright. And it's much more what we would be looking for in terms of prescribing these sorts of AFOs. And the same again with terminal stance, we've got really massive extension force, and so that could be quite dangerous in the future. But typically, our patients would come back, or we would pick that up first, because that would need to be the patient. It wouldn't quite look right. Most of our patients have been doing this for long enough so that the parents know what it should be like. And in the terminal stance, we've got the GRF going sort of around kneecap level, and it's going behind the knee. So it'd be providing a nice gastroc, hip flexor, and hamstring stretch, which is kind of what we want and what I'll kind of go into a little bit later. So we have designer metatarsals. We've got footwear design. We use three types of shoes most of the time. We use Hummels, which are the ones on the left. We use Doonas, which are the ones on the right. And then there's another brand which are very good called Billy Boots. All three of these are very well designed for AFOs. Hummels tend to have the Velcro extended because it's not quite long enough, but otherwise it's wide enough and deep enough. Billy Boots are specifically designed for AFOs, and then Doonas are the same. They've got the boa cables and the backs come down for some of our larger AFOs. And we will adapt the soles to accommodate for any tuning wedges that we'll have to do. We normally put them on the outside rather than on the inside, so we can get a better fit around the AFO. And we'll do any sort of floats at the same time. But we've got a flexible shoe on the left for a flexible AFO, and we've got a rigid shoe for a rigid AFO as well. So the actual tuning process, so Elaine goes into this a lot during her training course, and if you haven't been on it, I highly advise it. She goes into this a lot more detail than I ever could, really. But the main thing we're looking at is that sort of inclination of the shank. So here we have my director walking up and down on the Gait Lab, and we can see that his shank is inclined about 10 to 12 degrees on average, somewhere between 10 and 12 degrees, averaging about 11.4, 11.6, depending on who you ask and who you see. But that is kind of what we're looking for. So if you just get an AFO and you just put it in a shoe, you will typically get a SVA, a shank to vertical angle, like on the right, of about maybe 5 to 10 degrees. You normally have to add some wedging in some way, shape, or form to sort of push them that little bit further over. So a very common misconception will be that the angle of the AFO and the SVA are the same, but they're not. They're two very different things, and we look at them in very different ways. The angle of the angle is the AFO is for determining the actual fit of the AFO, to determine how much accommodation we have to use, and the SVA is for the functionality of the AFO. So the reason why we do this, so here's my director again, is we're trying to extend the, we're trying to push the GRF into the optimal position. So here we have gastroc as being stretched twice during gait, once at terminal swing and once at terminal stance. Terminal swing is quite hard if you have weak dorsiflexors, which most of our patients will have, but maximum extension at terminal swing, sorry, and then at terminal stance, this is a lot easier to try to adjust, because this would just be a case of getting the GRF in the right place. And if you look at my director on the right, he's essentially doing a lunge at that point, and he is dynamically stretching that muscle and strengthening it at the same time. So that is almost perfect physio, perfect stretching inbuilt in a device, and that's the kind of thing that we aim for. The reason why SVA is so important to talk about, so here we have a little girl, she's doing very well. She looks like she's walking quite well until she gets onto the gait plates, and you realize that those GRFs are a little bit too far anterior. But if you change the SVA by a single degree, not by much, you'll end up with a much straighter position. And you get, oops, sorry. it in the kneecap, stretching the gastroc, stretching the hips, trying to, and by doing that, you can avoid any sort of contractures or potential issues in the future. Footwear adherence sole design, this one is a bit trickier to do because you normally do it patient by patient, but we would add a rocker to try to facilitate the third and fourth rocker. Nikki was sort of saying earlier about extended METs AFOs being rigid and taking away a rocker, and that is fine for most. That's fine for some patients when you're doing sort of stepping practice, but when you start wanting to try to promote that third and fourth rocker, that's when you have to add something in exterior on the bottom. And then finally, we go on to the heel float outs, which we normally use for posterior balance or to try to influence the initial contact in some way. Here we have one of our patients sort of walking barefoot. We've seen him for multiple years now. This is sort of like the latest iteration of how he's been getting on. And we can sort of see that he's doing okay in terms of mid stance, not fantastic, but not awful. Sort of arrows going through the knee, thighs maybe a little bit over inclined, maybe shank's a little bit over inclined, and he's leaning forward, but mainly due to his using his poles. But terminal stance, he's not doing particularly great without sort of assistance. As my sort of concern there would be if we sort of left him, if he was a lot younger, he's done most of his growing now, those muscles would start to contract because they're not being stretched enough, they're not being dynamically used. And as I was saying before, it's not only AFOs that we use. So here he has some SMOs and he has some wedged shoes. So the wedged shoes are to try to remove the plantar flexion retractors, and then the SMOs are just trying to hold his feet in a little bit of a better position to try to avoid some issues with that. And his walking it's okay, it's functional. But in this case, like I was saying before, we wouldn't really expect our patients to use our AFOs sort of, every waking second. We would sort of give them the prescription of the AFO and we would give them a dosage of how much they should really be using them. So depending on how much and what they use them for, we would then determine how much they would have to do that. Okay, so here he is with his AFOs, walking pretty well. And we have optimal mid stance, optimal terminal stance. And in sort of comparison, sort of barefoot with AFOs, he's walking a lot better. He uses these mainly for therapy at the moment, sort of a few hours a day of sort of good walking around to try to stop any issues in the future. We produced a paper, like I said, with Elaine and a few of my colleagues, talking about how in plantar flex AFOs we were still finding that the calves were lengthening inside them purely because of that optimal SVA, using that GRF in the right place to stretch those gastrocs, to stretch those soleus muscles into a more optimal position. So sort of in conclusion, we're using OSKAR. OSKAR is a precise method of prescription and management of lower limb orthotics. We can use OSKAR to protect the body from deforming forces during growth and gait. We can use OSKAR to reduce the need for further invasive interventions, which is something that we've seen in clinic. And then we can use OSKAR to set goals using the ICF chart and measure those outcomes to sort of achieve those goals. Here's some essential reading. You'll notice most of it's Elaine. And here's some more publications of Elaine as well. I thoroughly advise to read it all, as well as Nikki's work, to sort of get a really good idea of what is the most up-to-date research is in terms of ankle foot orthoses. In terms of the future, who knows? It's a bit of a mystery at the moment. Is the next big thing going to be carbon or some sort of super material? Is it going to be Gait Lab improvements? Is it going to be 3D printing? Is it going to be articulated ankle joints with the sort of dynamic ones coming from certain companies like Fior and Genst and as such, where we can sort of influence the GRFs in a dynamic position? I'm not sure. I think 3D printing is probably the biggest thing happening at the moment, and I hope it does become bigger because I think it will be the biggest help. You know, the idea being that you could assess a child, scan, create a orthosis, and then fit it in the same day, or do it abroad or the such, would be amazing, I think. And finally, thank you everyone for having me on, and thank you everyone for listening. Any questions at all, Sean?
Yeah, we've just had some questions. So first, thanks for that. And don't worry, I think we'll have to go through what I've written in my thesis so far and check I've used all the right terminology as well.
Yeah.
So the first question is similar to the one I asked Nikki, and it's about sort of getting people to use these algorithms and uptake, and how, I think you mentioned it a couple of times, sort of it appears daunting when you first see the algorithm and things like that. How do you think that can be improved from that side? Is it a teaching thing, or is it?
Yeah, I think most of it comes down to time. I mean, in clinic, that's basically your biggest resource is how much time or you do or don't have. So I'm quite lucky in that I work in private sector, so I can sort of give myself enough time. But it is, you know, it is very hard here in the UK when you're working in the NHS and you might have 10 minutes a patient. It's very hard to suddenly, you know, do all these measurements, do all these algorithms with the patient in there. I mean, the only way you can really get better with it is by practice. And I mean, I've been doing it for 2 years now, and I can do most of it by almost instinct by this point. Every now and again, something will pop up and I'll have to go back to the algorithm, but it's almost second nature. And that is the kind of step that you want to be at. You don't want to be at the, you know, spending 10 minutes going through the algorithm for every single patient. It's just too time consuming. You're generally trying to look for getting proficient enough with it so that you can do it without thinking.
Yeah, definitely. We have had some questions from the audience as well. There's two that sort of fit nicely together. So Paul first asked, obviously you've been talking quite a lot about the facilities you've got at LOC and the full Gait Lab. Is there a way of implementing OSKAR without these technologies? And then from Eunice, this ties into, is there also a way of applying this in low and middle income countries and countries that don't have this technology?
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, I don't know too much about sort of low and middle income sort of facilities, but in terms of using it in sort of day-to-day practice, I mean, we have a Gait Lab. I'm incredibly lucky, and I think that every day when I'm using it. But you don't necessarily need a Gait Lab to do it. You need to do the sort of last sort of 10-20%, and those sort of more difficult patients might be a case where you need it, but sort of generally so a sort of slow motion camera of some kind, or, you know, most smartphones these days have a slow motion camera on them. That's probably your biggest help. And then trying to get good footwear as well. And so two of the companies that we use, Hummel and Billy boots, they're not very expensive. The Dunas are quite expensive because they're generally custom made, but the Billy boots and the Hummels are a little bit on the cheaper side, and they do have their pluses and minuses, but they generally work a lot easier. And once you've got sort of a good shoe and you've got a good sort of gait analysis, you can start to do bits of this. I mean, again, we've been doing it for 5 years. We've got an in-house workshop. We've got the Gait Lab. We've got pretty much everything you could want for this kind of thing. So I would like to look into it a little bit more on how we could get this a little bit better implemented, in the sense that, you know, I work in a pretty much perfect place for this kind of thing, and I do really sympathize that you know, I might be doing it this way, but not many other places are going to be able to do it. And I would like to try to think about how to do that a little bit better. I think Elaine has been trying to do a little bit more work with how to do that in clinical Alesia, but yeah, I would say the big things are sort of shoes. If you can adapt shoes, that's been the game changer for me in terms of my practice. But that's a whole extra cost, whole extra sending off shoes, etc. And it's a big commitment, essentially. If you get that shoe size wrong, you're in a bit of trouble. But yeah, yeah, I would say sort of slow motion camera, and you can do your SVAs relatively easily. Better shoes, so you don't have to start sending away patients. You know, you might fit them with an AFO. This is what I tended to do in the NHS, was fit them with an AFO and then tell them to go get shoes, come back in a few weeks, and then what? You know, what? And then suddenly I've got to tune it, but it's been a few weeks down the line because of waiting lists or the such, and then suddenly everything sort of is delayed. It's not really ideal. So yeah, I would say shoes and slow motion camera, and you can sort of do most of it on with that.
Okay, thank you. Cheers. I think that's all we've got time for questions. So thanks for coming along and thanks for presenting well for us. We're now going to take another short break. We've got about 15 minutes until the next session, which is the user prosthesis interface. And we've got talks from Dr. Nia, Dr. Kia Nazarapur and Dr. Stefania Fatone. In the meantime, during this break, please feel free to explore the website, the spatial chat system, get involved with the Faces of P&O, and just we'll see you back here. Thank you.